Hi, welcome to Maps 101. I'm your professor, Dr. Bush. Now, let's get started. This is North America. I, I'm sorry. I just don't believe it. I mean, look at this. Why is Mexico so small? What, what is this thing? And where's the rest of Canada? This is not Maps 101. He's lying to you. This is terrible. It's awful. Oh my God, take those stupid glasses off. You're indoors. It's ridiculous. I don't know what you're talking about. Look, maps aren't perfect. Sometimes you shrink things. Sometimes you enlarge things. By the way, this is Cuba. Just so you know. Sometimes you leave things out. Look, maps, they're useful. But even with today's technology, with satellites and stuff, maps aren't perfect. And for a long time, they were a lot worse than they are right now. I'm sorry, are you still talking? Can you get on with the presentation now? I mean, are we really going to have to look at you throughout this entire presentation? Please don't make them. I mean, these poor people. Don't make them look at you. I'm so sorry. No, you're not going to have to look at me throughout the entire presentation. Sorry about him. He's insufferable. But stick with me. You'll learn a little bit about Renaissance maps. And welcome to Maps 101.
All right, let's get started. And so, if you're starting anything, you must start at the beginning, and we will do the same. So we have to go back to medieval map making. Now, medieval map making was best known for their mappa mundi. These were traditional depictions of the known world. They graced the walls of cathedrals and pages of manuscripts and pretty much all over the medieval world. It had two basic geographical components. You had the O of the ocean and the T of the bodies of water that were in the center that separated the three parts of the world, of the known world at that time. Those were Asia, Europe, and Africa. And you may say, that looks nothing like a map. This person's crazy. Yeah, it really doesn't look like a map, but it was. And though it didn't tell too much geographical information, this wasn't its main purpose. Its main purpose was to convey a symbolic intent, and the symbolic intent was to remind the viewer God had created this world, which was represented by a circle of lands that center was Jerusalem. So Jerusalem appeared actually in the center of a number of these kinds of maps, and that was the main purpose. It was sort of a religious, more abstract idea. It didn't really care about, how big is Asia, or the shape, or even which one was which. There was one map that had Africa written over Europe and Europe written over Africa, and it didn't matter to them because that just wasn't the point. But as you went on into the Renaissance by 1500, the old maps had needed to be replaced, at least among the educated, and they were replaced by a type of map that came from Ptolemy. So this is Ptolemy, and though he looks like he's telling you off for doing something wrong, he was actually a very important philosopher and mathematician and cartographer. And so he made a map called the Geographia, and it came about way before the Renaissance, but still had a great impact on the thinkers and citizens of that age due to its translation to Latin in 1406. And so this is a map of the known world from 1513 edition, and it can serve to summarize some of the changes introduced by this new cartography. Obviously, it's not perfect. Africa looks like a block. The New World, obviously, North and South America aren't there. They didn't know about it, but it did have a number of important changes, one of which was very important was the grid of longitude and latitude lines. And so this allowed the mapmaker to do something for the first time that they couldn't do before, which was to model the relationship of objects and locations on the surface of Earth. For the first time, you could say, "Oh, I live, here's Spain. There's England. That's how close they are to each other. That's how they relate." Um, and so, even if it wasn't perfect, and it's very far from perfect, there's a lot of blank space. But this wasn't just produced by some sort of ignorance of, undiscovered geographical features, but it was rather more of an abstract space into which new geographies were going to be plotted. They expected that something else would be uncovered and something else would be plotted there. And so that existence was sort of presupposed by the geometry of the grid. And so this was a very influential map and influenced many cartographers, one of which was Francesco Rosselli. This was his oval planisphere, and it came out of a need to, redefine the world thanks to European exploration. They found the New World, new islands were created, a southern continent appeared, the Atlantic was redefined, and the Pacific Ocean was sort of created. But obviously still far from perfect. But yeah, we can see now how it reflects how the sort of cosmographical idea of the world, was created by God, and from that kind of religious map into more of a realistic representation that was defined by the processes of exploration that now reflected the world here. And so this was a map that he printed in 1508, and it's important for several reasons. First, it's among the earliest printed maps of the New World. It's an essential source for Columbus's fourth voyage because it depicts the New World discoveries made by that voyage on the eastern coast of Asia. Now, you might say, hey, wait a minute, Columbus didn't actually sail to Asia, he went to America. You'd be right, but he thought he had sailed to Asia, and so this map was drawn out as if he had gone and been on the coast of Asia. So that's why you may not recognize a lot of this, is because they truly thought that that was just, part of Asia. But it introduced a whole new oval projection world that was later adopted by Battista Agnesi and Abraham Artelius, both of whose maps will appear later in the presentation. So we can look directly at Battista Agnesi's map. And so he was a cartographer who made a world map in 1536, and this documented the travels of Magellan. So you can see again how the theme of exploration comes out. And so this is Magellan's trip here in the illustrated in the black line. And you can see the coast of South Africa looks kind of like, South America looks pretty much like South America because he had been there and reported back about where he had traveled. Whereas, farther north, not so much. They didn't really know what was up there. And it did repeat some errors, in the Eurasian coastlines and, creating islands that didn't actually exist. But it showed with a decent amount of accuracy the coastline of the New World. And so we can see from the early 16th century, thanks to a new mathematical interest in cartographical projections that could take into account the curvature of the Earth and just more accurate assessments, as well as the ever-expanding knowledge of the world's surface, for the first time, Europeans were able to imagine, believably, the geographical space in which they lived compared to the rest of the world. And this only continued. This was a map in 1520 that culminated in a 5-foot engraved version of Europe. It was the largest representation of that time of any continent, and it's unbelievably triumphalistic. You can see clearly the plains, the forests, the mountain chains, and it's absolutely crammed with names of towns and cities. And so, imagine you lived somewhere in Europe. You could finally look and say, oh, wait, that's my town. That's where I live, as compared to the rest of Europe. And this sparked a great deal of interest. In the 16th century, cartography was almost a craze. The number of professionals grew, and they were joined by a huge number of amateurs who were interested in recording this. Landlords needed maps. Governments obviously needed maps for administrative purposes, as well as for the plotting of roads and all of that kind of thing. And so they became quite necessary, as well as sort of just thought-provoking and interesting. And so all over Europe, they became part of the furniture of the houses, especially I'm talking mostly in educated men and well-off people, but maps were framed, hung, woven into tapestries, and you went into a house, there was likely a map in there. And so it became quite commonplace. It became so common that in Christopher Marlowe's play, in the last line called out from a dying character said, "Give me a map, and then let me see how much is left for me to conquer all the world." And so you can see maps greatly became involved and entwined into the public consciousness. And in 1570, there was another development, and this is the idea of the atlas. This was the Theatrum by Ortelius, who I mentioned earlier, and it was published and included 53 maps. Most of them were of Europe, but 53 maps was a long time, especially back then. It was probably the most expensive book published in the 16th century. But it still experienced tremendous financial success, and more atlases were created that you could finally look and zoom in on certain parts of the world. And so Europeans, for the first time, come to this idea of this personal location within the whole world. And this sort of self-orientation was further developed by the parallel growth of chorography. And chorography is the description of these places. So the antiquities, the customs, the traditions. And so it almost became a sort of patriotism. And indeed, Ortelius stated that the reason for publishing his atlas was that every European wants to see a map of his own country for the love that he beareth to his native soil. And so patriotism was indeed entwined with this development of maps. And you can see this further in the representations of cities. They're no longer imprecise. I mean, this was a 1470 map of Florence. It's astonishingly detailed. And this is a map of De Barbary of Venice. Again, there's so much detail. A citizen who lived there could look really closely and go, oh yeah, that's my house. That's where I live. And so as you went on, there was an idea of patriotism, but there wasn't so much of an idea of boundaries. Even geographical features, the sea was thought of as a boundary. But not much else. Mountain ranges, not really. Rivers, no. No city or country would be content having a river as a border. So borders weren't often apparent. Only gradually were they sort of entered into these maps and atlases. Even color, though you may have seen it earlier, wasn't really used to depict boundaries, but rather was sort of a decorative addition, or it was used to define broad geographical zones. Unlike the maps of today, where you can see the borders of every country very clearly defined. So take the ideas that we've been looking at and sort of apply them to the maps of today. You can see that we really focus on the boundaries of the different countries. And so maps can have a huge impact on the way people think of their world. And so the consequences of this development of maps in the Renaissance was felt by Europeans and non-Europeans. The historian of cartography, David Woodward, stated that the developmental idea allowed for the idea of the world over which systematic dominance was possible, and provided a powerful framework for political expansion and control, meaning that Europeans, because they had developed the maps, they now thought of themselves as the only ones who could determine how territory was defined. And so this sort of stripped native people around the world of their authority to say, this is my land, this is where the border is. Instead, Europeans sort of said, no, this is, these are our maps, this is where you are. And so for the first time, you can see Europeans uncovering their own place in the world and learning how they fit into it. Maps, for the first time, didn't just symbolize some grandiose idea of the world or serve some religious purpose, and they became what we see now in our maps, which is a representation, maybe far from a perfect one, but a representation nonetheless of a world resembling the actual Earth. And that came to shape a lot of beliefs held by people in that time. So thank you for watching. These are my references. You don't actually have to read those.
Is it over? It is. Oh my God. Yes.